The wealthy man's cruel laughter sliced through the upscale Chicago restaurant. "Little girl, I'm ordering an Arabic. Do you even understand?" His Armani suit gleamed while she stood trembling, fingers clutching the small UNESCO pin on her apron, a reminder of who she truly was, the millionaire prepared to humiliate this American server for sport. What he didn't know was that this woman possessed a secret that would shatter his arrogance completely. Tonight, power would shift in ways he never imagined, and justice would be served colder than his expensive wine. The man who thought money made him superior was about to learn that respect cannot be bought. We've all felt invisible at some point, dismissed by those who think they know our worth. But sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truths, and dignity always finds a way to rise. The evening rush at Marina Bay Steakhouse moved with its usual orchestrated chaos, servers weaving between tables like dancers who knew every step by heart. Elena Johnson adjusted her black apron for the 100th time that shift, her feet aching in the worn leather shoes she'd polished that morning until they gleamed. 9 hours into her shift, exhaustion pulled at her shoulders, but she maintained the professional smile that had become second nature over the past 3 years. The restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan's dark waters, where the Chicago skyline reflected like scattered diamonds, and the Navy Pier Ferris wheel turned slowly against the night sky. This was the kind of place where tourists and wealthy locals came to celebrate special occasions, where a single bottle of wine could cost more than Elena made in a week. Elena had always found comfort in the rhythm of service, the precise choreography of taking orders, delivering plates, clearing tables. There was dignity in the work, she reminded herself, even when her lower back screamed in protest, and her smile felt more like a mask than an expression of genuine warmth. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify. The dining room buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, a symphony of accents and laughter that reminded her of places she used to know well, worlds that felt impossibly distant now. She touched the small UNESCO education pin on her apron collar, a habit that surfaced whenever stress threatened to crack her composed exterior. The metal was warm from her body heat, a tiny anchor to a past that sometimes felt like someone else's life entirely. The hostess, Maria Santos, approached with her usual harried expression. "Elena, I need you to take table 8. 4 gentlemen. They specifically requested our best server." Elena nodded, gathering menus and checking her reflection in the polished surface of a wine glass. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place, despite the hectic pace of the evening. She straightened her shoulders and walked across the dining room with the confident stride that came from years of navigating crowded restaurants, her posture betraying the education and poise that her current circumstances couldn't diminish. The table by the window was prime real estate, reserved for the restaurant's most valued customers, and Elena could already sense the weight of expectation that came with serving VIPs. As she approached table 8, Elena immediately recognized the type of clientele she was dealing with. 4 Middle Eastern men, all impeccably dressed, occupied the coveted window seats. The obvious leader of the group commanded attention without saying a word. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from never having to ask for anything twice. His Giorgio Armani suit fit him like it had been crafted specifically for his frame, and the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist caught the restaurant's ambient lighting with every gesture. Omar al-Rashid, though Elena didn't know his name yet, surveyed the dining room with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. His dark eyes moved over Elena with the same calculating assessment he might give to a piece of furniture functional, replaceable, beneath his notice. Elena set the menus down with practiced grace, her professional smile firmly in place. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Marina Bay Steakhouse. My name is Elena, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Her voice carried the slight musical quality that came from growing up bilingual, though she was careful to keep her accent neutral and professional. The men barely glanced up from their conversation, which Elena recognized as Arabic, though she gave no indication of understanding. She'd learned long ago that revealing too much about herself to customers could lead to complications. Questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Connections she couldn't afford to make. The safest approach was to remain invisible, efficient, forgettable. Exactly what these men expected from their server. Omar al-Rashid leaned back in his chair with the fluid motion of someone who had never known physical discomfort. His eyes finally settling on Elena with undisguised condescension. "Before we begin," he said, his English carrying the crisp precision of expensive international schools, "I want you to know that we are very particular about service. We've traveled extensively, and we have high standards." His companions nodded in agreement, their own expressions ranging from amused to openly dismissive. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with difficult customers, but she maintained her composure, her hands steady as she prepared to take their drink orders. She'd handled worse than entitled millionaires before, though something about this particular group made her skin tight with unease. The conversation at the table continued in Arabic, and Elena couldn't help but notice the way they gestured in her direction, their tone making it clear she was the subject of their discussion. She stood patiently, waiting for them to acknowledge her presence, her training kicking in automatically. Never interrupt a customer's conversation. Always wait to be addressed. Smile until your face hurts if necessary. These were the unwritten rules of high-end service, the invisible boundaries that separated the servers from the served. But tonight, those boundaries felt more pronounced than usual, weighted with an undercurrent of disrespect that went beyond the typical customer-server dynamic. Elena unconsciously touched her UNESCO pin again, drawing strength from the small reminder of who she really was beneath the uniform and the professional facade. Omar's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "Actually," he said, switching back to English with theatrical precision, "let me test something." His smile held no warmth, only the kind of cruel amusement that comes from someone who enjoys demonstrating their superiority over others. Elena's pulse quickened, though she couldn't yet identify the source of her growing unease. The other diners at nearby tables seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, conversations growing quieter as attention subtly turned toward table 8. Even the usually bustling servers slowed their pace, creating an almost imperceptible circle of witnesses around what was about to unfold. The ambient sounds of the restaurant clinking silverware, murmured conversations, the distant hum of the kitchen, seemed to fade as Omar al-Rashid prepared to deliver what he clearly considered a masterful demonstration of American ignorance. Elena stood perfectly still, her professional mask intact, but every instinct she possessed told her that this moment would change everything. The UNESCO pin felt warm against her collar, and somewhere in the depths of her memory, she could hear her father's voice telling her that dignity was something no one could take away unless you let them. Tonight, she would discover just how much truth lived in those words. Omar al-Rashid's voice carried across the dining room, with the deliberate projection of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Little girl," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "I'm going to order in Arabic, and I want to see if you can understand even a single word." His companions leaned forward with anticipation, their expressions ranging from amused curiosity to outright mockery. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her professional composure, her hands clasped behind her back in the standard service position. The nearby tables had grown noticeably quieter, other diners sensing the uncomfortable dynamic unfolding at table 8. Through the vast windows, the Ferris wheel continued its slow rotation, indifferent to the human drama playing out in its shadow. Elena took a measured breath before responding, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I apologize, sir, but I'll need you to place your order in English, so I can serve you properly." Her words carried the practiced diplomacy of someone who had navigated countless difficult customer interactions, but Omar's reaction suggested he viewed her reasonable request as confirmation of his prejudices. He threw back his head and laughed. A sound devoid of genuine humor, designed to humiliate rather than express joy. His companions joined in, creating a chorus of mockery that made several nearby diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. Elena's grip tightened imperceptibly on her order pad, the only outward sign of her growing distress. "Typical American," Omar announced loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Monolingual and proud of it. This is exactly what's wrong with your country. No curiosity about the world beyond your borders. No respect for other cultures." He gestured dismissively at Elena, as if she were an exhibit in a museum of American ignorance. His friends nodded in eager agreement, one adding in accented English, "In Dubai, even our housekeepers speak 3 languages fluently. Education is valued in civilized societies." The words hung in the air like poison, and Elena felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, her individual worth dismissed based on assumptions about her background and circumstances. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to dim further as more diners became aware of the confrontation. Manager James Wilson emerged from behind the host station, his trained eye immediately assessing the situation at table 8. He'd worked in high-end hospitality long enough to recognize trouble brewing, but he also knew that wealthy customers like Omar al-Rashid paid the bills and kept the lights on. The delicate balance between protecting his staff and maintaining customer satisfaction was a tightrope he walked daily, and Elena could see the internal conflict playing out across his features. She gave him the slightest shake of her head, a signal that she could handle the situation, though her confidence was more performance than reality. Omar stood up slowly, his impressive height and commanding presence designed to intimidate. "I'll make this interesting," he declared, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a leather wallet that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. The movement was theatrical, calculated to draw maximum attention from the growing audience of diners and staff. "I'm willing to bet that you don't know a single language other than English, not one." His voice carried the certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything that mattered, and Elena could see the cruel anticipation in his eyes as he prepared to deliver what he clearly considered the coup de grace of his argument. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar stirring that she'd learned to suppress over the past 3 years. It was the same feeling she'd experienced in lecture halls and conference rooms, the quiet confidence that came from knowledge hard-earned and deeply understood. "Actually, sir," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word, "I do speak several languages." The admission hung in the air like a challenge, and she watched Omar's expression change from smug certainty to surprised interest. His companions exchanged glances, their earlier mockery temporarily replaced by curiosity about this unexpected development. "Several?" Omar's tone carried a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. "Like what? High school French? Basic Spanish for restaurant work?" He was already reaching for his wallet again, his confidence apparently unshaken by Elena's claim. The dining room had grown so quiet that the soft jazz playing through the sound system seemed amplified, creating an almost cinematic backdrop for the confrontation. Elena could feel dozens of eyes upon her, servers and diners alike drawn to witness what was rapidly becoming the evening's main entertainment. She thought of her father in his wheelchair, of her mother's exhausted face after 12-hour days caring for him, of the bills that never stopped coming, and the dreams that had been set aside, but never forgotten. "I speak 9 languages fluently," Elena said, the words carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to electrify the air around table 8. The response was immediate and explosive. Omar's entire table erupted in laughter, the sound harsh and disbelieving. One of his companions actually slapped the table, his amusement apparently genuine in its cruelty. Other diners looked mortified by the display, some actually turning away from the spectacle, while others leaned forward with fascination. Elena stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, her professional composure intact, despite the heat burning in her cheeks and the rapid thundering of her pulse in her ears. Omar's laughter gradually subsided into a predatory smile that revealed perfectly white teeth. 9 languages, he repeated, savoring each syllable like a fine wine. Did everyone hear that? Our little waitress here claims to speak 9 languages. He looked around the dining room as if seeking witnesses to what he clearly considered an outrageous lie. The theatrical gesture was designed to maximize Elena's humiliation, to turn her into a public spectacle for the entertainment of his wealthy companions. But something in Elena's posture, the way she held her head high, the steady gaze that never wavered, suggested that she was far from defeated. "Prove it," Omar declared, his voice carrying the ring of absolute authority. He pulled out his wallet with a flourish, counting out 10 crisp $100 bills onto the white tablecloth. The money seemed to glow under the restaurant's ambient lighting, a tangible symbol of the power dynamic at play. $1,000 if you can prove you speak 9 languages. But if you're lying, if this is just some pathetic attempt to impress us, then you get down on your knees and apologize to me in front of everyone in this restaurant. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire dining room was holding its collective breath. Elena looked at the money spread across the table, an amount that represented 2 weeks of income from all 3 of her jobs combined, then raised her eyes to meet Omar's confident gaze. "I accept your challenge," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent restaurant with crystal clarity. "But when I win, you honor your word." She began untying her apron with steady hands, her movements deliberate and controlled. The simple action seemed to transform her from server to participant, from victim to challenger. Omar's smile widened with anticipation, clearly convinced that he was about to witness the humiliation of an arrogant American who had overestimated her own abilities. What he didn't know was that Elena Johnson was about to give him an education he would never forget. Elena folded her apron with deliberate precision, setting it on an empty chair as if she were preparing for a performance rather than a public humiliation. The simple act transformed her bearing completely. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and something indefinable shifted in her presence. The exhausted waitress from moments before seemed to dissolve, replaced by someone who commanded attention through quiet confidence rather than desperate bravado. Omar watched this transformation with amusement, clearly convinced he was witnessing the desperate theatrics of someone about to be exposed as a fraud. His companions leaned back in their chairs, settling in to enjoy what they anticipated would be a swift and entertaining demolition of American pretensions. "I accept your challenge," Elena repeated, her voice carrying a musical quality that hadn't been present during her earlier interactions. "But let's establish the rules clearly. You'll test me in 4 languages you know personally, and if I demonstrate fluency in all of them, you'll accept that I speak 9 languages total." Omar nodded eagerly, his confidence unshaken by Elena's newfound composure. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu theater, with servers discreetly positioning themselves for better views, and diners abandoning all pretense of focusing on their meals. Even the kitchen staff had begun emerging through the service doors, drawn by the electric tension that had settled over the restaurant like a charged storm cloud. Omar began in Arabic, his voice taking on the fluid cadences of his native tongue as he spoke about his family's oil business in Dubai, deliberately choosing complex terminology and cultural references that would confound even someone with basic conversational skills. He spoke for nearly a minute, weaving together business concepts with personal anecdotes, his expression growing more satisfied with each complicated phrase. When he finished, the silence stretched taut as every person in the restaurant waited for Elena's response. She stood perfectly still for a moment, as if translating not just language, but switching between entire worldviews, then began to speak. The Arabic that flowed from Elena's lips was flawless, carrying the precise accent of someone who had spent significant time in the Gulf region. She responded to Omar's business discussion with sophisticated observations about oil market fluctuations, then seamlessly transitioned into questions about his family's heritage and the cultural traditions of Dubai. Her pronunciation was so authentic that Omar's companion Stamboun was actually straightened in their chairs, their amused expressions replaced by genuine surprise. Omar himself seemed momentarily stunned, his confident smile flickering as he realized this was not going according to his carefully planned script. The nearby diners, who had expected to witness a quick humiliation, found themselves leaning forward, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. Without missing a beat, Elena switched to French, her voice taking on the sophisticated inflection of educated Parisians as she discussed French cuisine and the influence of culinary traditions on cultural identity. The transformation was remarkable, not just in language, but in her entire demeanor, as if each tongue she spoke activated different aspects of her personality. Omar recovered enough to respond in French, but his accent carried the slight stiffness of someone who had learned the language in school rather than absorbed it through immersion. Elena's response flowed like music, incorporating literary references and cultural observations that demonstrated not just linguistic ability, but deep cultural understanding. The Spanish that followed wasn't the casual Mexican-American dialect that Omar had clearly expected, but the sophisticated Castilian pronunciation of academic study, peppered with references to Spanish literature and the complex political history of the Iberian Peninsula. By now, Omar's expression had shifted from amusement to genuine concern, and his companions were exchanging glances that suggested their earlier confidence was rapidly evaporating. The restaurant staff had abandoned all pretense of work, gathering in a loose circle around table 8 like witnesses to a miracle. Even manager James stood transfixed, his usual professional composure replaced by open-mouthed amazement. When Elena began speaking German, her voice took on the precise, scholarly tone of someone who had engaged with the language at the highest academic levels. She discussed classical music and German philosophical traditions with the fluency of a native speaker. Her pronunciation so perfect that the elderly German couple at table 12 actually began whispering excitedly to each other in recognition of their homeland's tongue. Omar's face had grown noticeably pale, the confident arrogance that had defined his evening crumbling with each perfectly constructed sentence that emanated from this woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. "That's 4 languages," Elena said calmly, switching back to English with the same effortless transition that had marked all her linguistic changes. "You wanted proof of 9. Here are the remaining 5. Without waiting for Omar's response, she turned toward the Chinese couple at the nearby table and began speaking Mandarin with them, her tones precise and her cultural references so accurate that they responded with obvious delight and surprise. The conversation flowed naturally as she discussed their hometown of Beijing and shared observations about traditional festivals, her pronunciation carrying the authority of someone who had spent significant time in China rather than merely studied the language in textbooks. The Russian that followed came as she addressed Victor, the restaurant's busboy, who had been standing transfixed by the linguistic display. Elena spoke to him about his family in Moscow, with the warm familiarity of someone who understood not just the language, but the culture it represented. Victor's face lit up with joy as he responded enthusiastically, their rapid exchange creating a pocket of homeland comfort in the middle of an upscale Chicago restaurant. The Italian chef, Antonio, emerged from the kitchen drawn by reports of the extraordinary scene, and Elena immediately engaged him in a discussion of regional cooking techniques that demonstrated not just linguistic fluency, but deep appreciation for the cultural nuances that separated Roman cuisine from Sicilian traditions. The Portuguese that followed was directed toward Maria, the Brazilian hostess, and their conversation about Rio de Janeiro's carnival celebrations was so animated and culturally informed that other diners began applauding spontaneously. Finally, Elena turned to a young Japanese couple who had been among the most attentive observers of the evening's drama, and began discussing anime and Japanese cultural traditions with the kind of nuanced understanding that comes from genuine immersion rather than casual study. Each conversation was natural and unforced, demonstrating not just linguistic ability, but the kind of cultural fluency that takes years to develop. The restaurant erupted in applause that started with a single diner and spread like wildfire throughout the dining room. Servers, kitchen staff, and customers alike rose to their feet in spontaneous appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Omar al-Rashid sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of shock and growing comprehension that he had just been thoroughly, completely, and publicly educated by someone he had attempted to humiliate. His companions looked equally stunned, their earlier mockery replaced by something approaching awe as they struggled to process the magnitude of their misjudgment. Elena stood in the center of the applause, her professional composure returning as she smoothed her uniform and prepared to resume her role as their server. But something fundamental had shifted in the restaurant's atmosphere and in the way every person present would remember this evening. The money still lay spread across Omar's table like an accusation. 10 $100 bills that represented not just a debt to be paid, but a lesson that had been delivered with devastating precision. The night was far from over, and the most profound revelations were yet to come. Omar al-Rashid's hands trembled visibly as he reached for the $100 bills scattered across the white tablecloth, each movement betraying the magnitude of his shock. The confident millionaire who had orchestrated this public challenge had been replaced by someone struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. His fingers fumbled with the crisp currency as he counted it out into Elena's steady hands, the simple transaction carrying the weight of a fundamental shift in power dynamics. The restaurant remained unusually quiet, as if the entire dining room was holding its collective breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented evening would continue to unfold. Elena accepted the money with quiet dignity, neither gloating nor showing any trace of the triumph that everyone knew she deserved to feel. "Who are you?" Omar's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, his earlier commanding presence reduced to genuine bewilderment. "You cannot simply be a waitress. No one develops that level of linguistic mastery by accident." His companions nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same mixture of confusion and growing respect that had replaced their earlier mockery. Elena looked around the restaurant, taking in the sea of expectant faces. Servers who had paused mid-task, diners who had abandoned their meals, Kitchen staff crowded in doorways, all waiting for an explanation that might make sense of what they had just experienced. The moment felt suspended in time, balanced on the edge of a revelation that would redefine everything these people thought they knew about the woman who had been serving their tables. Elena walked to an empty chair at a nearby table, her movements deliberate and graceful as she prepared to share a story she had kept hidden for 3 years. The simple act of sitting seemed to signal a shift from performance back to conversation, though the electric attention of her audience remained unchanged. "My name is Elena Johnson," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "And until 3 years ago, I was a language instructor at the University of Chicago." The collective intake of breath that followed her words was audible, a sound of recognition that this explanation was both surprising and yet somehow inevitable, given what they had just witnessed. "I specialized in documenting disappearing languages and teaching immigrant communities," Elena continued, her voice taking on the passionate tone of someone discussing work that had defined her identity. "I worked with UNESCO on cultural preservation projects in 25 countries, helping to record and maintain linguistic traditions before they vanished forever." She paused, touching the small UNESCO pin on her collar, a gesture that now carried profound meaning for everyone watching. "My research took me from indigenous communities in the Amazon to refugee camps in Europe, anywhere that languages were in danger of being lost to history. Each language I learned opened doorways to entire worldviews, ways of understanding human experience that can't be translated or replaced." The restaurant had become completely still, even the ambient sounds of the kitchen fading to nothing as Elena's story unfolded. Omar leaned forward in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching reverence as he began to understand the magnitude of his earlier behavior. "But 3 years ago," Elena's voice caught slightly, the professional composure wavering for the first time that evening. "My father, a construction foreman, who had worked his way up from nothing on Chicago's South Side, had a severe accident on a job site. Traumatic brain injury that left him partially paralyzed and requiring constant care. The silence that followed was respectful rather than expectant, as if the entire room recognized the sacred nature of the story being shared. My mother couldn't handle his care alone, Elena continued, her words painting a picture of impossible choices and family devotion that resonated through the restaurant like a church bell. I took a leave of absence from the university to help, thinking it would be temporary, maybe a semester or 2 at most. But my father's condition required full-time attention, and the medical bills began mounting faster than our insurance could cover them. My leave of absence became permanent resignation. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of servers and diners alike, including them in a story that had shaped every day of her life for the past 3 years. Now I work 3 jobs to keep our family afloat: morning ESL classes for new immigrants, afternoon freelance translation work, and evenings here. Every dollar goes toward my father's therapy and the medications that aren't covered by our insurance." The elderly woman at table 12 began crying openly, her husband reaching across to take her hand as Elena's story touched something fundamental in their understanding of sacrifice and love. Omar's face had transformed completely, the arrogant confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame, as he began to comprehend the true nature of the woman he had attempted to humiliate. His companions sat in stunned silence, their earlier laughter now seeming not just inappropriate, but actively cruel in the face of Elena's dignity and sacrifice. Manager James stepped forward from his position near the host station, his professional demeanor abandoned in favor of genuine human emotion as he looked at his employee with new eyes. "My education opened doors to the world, Elena said, her voice growing stronger as she neared the end of her story. But my heart brought me home to family. I don't regret the choice I made, because love doesn't calculate cost in career advancement or professional recognition. The strength I've gained from supporting my family through their darkest hour has taught me lessons no classroom could provide. But I also don't apologize for who I am or what I know, regardless of the uniform I wear or the job I do to support the people I love. She stood up slowly, the movement carrying her back into her role as server, while somehow maintaining the dignity of the scholar she had revealed herself to be. The transformation was remarkable. She was simultaneously both the exhausted waitress and the accomplished academic, proving that identity was far more complex than any single moment could capture. Omar rose from his chair as well, his impressive height no longer seeming intimidating, but rather diminished by the moral stature of the woman standing before him. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse that was audible throughout the silent restaurant. "Not for not knowing your story, no one could have known that, but for how I treated you as a human being. I judged you based on assumptions and prejudices that have no place in civilized society." His companions nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the shame of people who had participated in something they now recognized as fundamentally wrong. The apology hung in the air like an offering, sincere but insufficient, given the magnitude of the evening's events. Elena reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of being carried close to her heart. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a teaching certificate from the University of Chicago, creased and faded, but still bearing the official seals and signatures that testified to her academic achievements. "I carry this with me," she said quietly, "not because I'm ashamed of my current work, but because I refuse to let anyone else define who I am based on their limited understanding of my circumstances." The certificate passed through several hands as diners examined it with the reverence typically reserved for historical artifacts, proof of a hidden world that had existed parallel to their assumptions about the woman who had been serving their tables. The applause that followed was different from the earlier spontaneous appreciation for her linguistic abilities. This was deeper, more thoughtful. Recognition not just of talent, but of character, sacrifice, and the complex dignity of human experience. Elena accepted the recognition with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the evening, neither diminished by earlier humiliation, nor inflated by current praise. As the applause gradually faded, everyone in the restaurant understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a display of linguistic skill, but a masterclass in human dignity, resilience, and the dangerous assumptions that shape how we see and treat each other. The evening was far from over, but already it had become the kind of story that would be told and retold, a reminder that every person carries hidden depths that deserve respect, regardless of their current circumstances. The applause that erupted throughout Marina Bay Steakhouse was unlike anything the restaurant had ever witnessed, spontaneous, sustained, and deeply felt by every person who had been privileged to observe Elena's extraordinary demonstration. Diners rose from their chairs without coordination or prompting, their appreciation flowing from genuine respect rather than mere entertainment. The sound echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows, mixing with the gentle lapping of Lake Michigan waves against Navy Pier, creating a moment that felt both intimate and monumental. Elena stood quietly in the center of the ovation, her professional composure intact despite the overwhelming nature of the recognition, her hands clasped in front of her as she waited for the emotion to subside so she could return to the work that still needed to be done. As the applause gradually faded, diners began approaching Elena with business cards and offers of assistance that went far beyond mere sympathy. A successful businessman from Table 15 pressed his card into her hand, explaining that his import company desperately needed someone with her linguistic abilities for international negotiations. An elderly couple offered to help with her father's medical expenses, their generosity flowing from hearts touched by her story of sacrifice and devotion. Elena accepted each offer with grace, while gently deflecting the charity, her response consistent and dignified. "I don't need pity or handouts," she said repeatedly, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had defined the entire evening. "I just need to be treated with the same respect you would show any human being, regardless of their current circumstances." Omar's companions had undergone their own transformation during the course of the evening, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine shame and a growing understanding of their collective behavior. One of them, a distinguished man with graying temples, approached Elena separately to offer his own apology. "We came here tonight, thinking we were sophisticated men of the world," he said, his accent carrying the same educated precision as Omar's, but without the earlier arrogance. "Instead, we behaved like ignorant children, and you've shown us what true sophistication actually looks like. We are deeply sorry for our part in this embarrassing display." His words carried the weight of sincere regret, and Elena accepted his apology with the same dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal, neither dismissing their shame nor dwelling on their earlier cruelty. Manager James Wilson approached with obvious respect and a decision that had been building throughout the evening's extraordinary events. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an important choice. "Effective immediately, you're getting a raise, and the restaurant will cover your full health insurance benefits. What happened here tonight showed me that we've been fortunate to have someone of your caliber on our staff, and I intend to make sure we keep you." The offer was generous and unexpected, but Elena's response revealed the complexity of her situation and the careful balance she maintained between pride and practicality. She accepted the raise with gratitude, while making it clear that her work schedule would remain the same. She still needed her other jobs to meet her family's ongoing financial obligations. What Elena didn't immediately notice was that several diners had been recording portions of the evening's events on their phones, capturing not just her linguistic demonstration, but the broader story of dignity in the face of humiliation. A young woman at Table 22 had live-streamed significant portions of the confrontation and its resolution, her video already garnering hundreds of views and comments from people who found themselves inspired by Elena's grace under pressure. The footage was remarkable, not for its production quality, but for its authentic capture of human behavior at its worst and best, showing both the cruel assumptions that poison social interactions and the transformative power of recognizing our shared humanity despite surface differences. Within hours of being posted, the video had begun spreading across social media platforms with the viral velocity that accompanies truly compelling human stories. The comments section filled with responses that ranged from outrage at Omar's initial behavior to admiration for Elena's handling of the situation. Viewers shared their own stories of being misjudged based on their jobs or circumstances, creating a digital community united by common experiences of having their worth questioned by people who knew nothing about their lives or struggles. The hashtags that emerged organically from the discussion reflected themes that resonated far beyond the confines of a single Chicago restaurant: respect for service workers, the danger of assumptions, and the hidden depths that exist within every human being. Local news stations picked up the story within 24 hours, recognizing its potential to spark meaningful conversations about class, respect, and the complex realities of modern American life. The coverage was thoughtful rather than sensationalized, focusing on the broader implications of Elena's story, rather than treating it as mere entertainment. Reporters interviewed linguistics professors, who explained the rarity of genuine fluency in 9 languages, immigration advocates, who discussed the sacrifices made by families like Elena's, and sociologists, who analyzed the assumptions that shape interactions between people from different economic backgrounds. The story resonated because it contained elements that everyone could relate to: the experience of being underestimated, the weight of family obligations, and the universal desire for basic human respect. Omar al-Rashid found himself in an uncomfortable but necessary position as the story gained traction. His role as the evening's antagonist making him a focal point for discussions about privilege, prejudice, and the possibility of genuine change. Rather than retreating into defensiveness or attempting to control the narrative, he chose a path that surprised many observers by reaching out to Elena directly for a private conversation. Their meeting, arranged through manager James, took place 2 days after the viral evening in a quiet corner of the restaurant during the slow afternoon hours when the dining room was nearly empty and their conversation could proceed without the pressure of public scrutiny. "I've been thinking constantly about that night," Omar began, his usual commanding presence replaced by something approaching vulnerability. "I grew up with every advantage: wealth, education, opportunities that most people can only dream about, and somehow I used those privileges to justify treating you with contempt. I want to understand how I became the kind of person who would behave that way, and more importantly, I want to make amends in a meaningful way." His words carried the ring of genuine self-examination rather than public relations damage control, suggesting that Elena's demonstration had catalyzed something deeper than mere embarrassment about being publicly corrected. Elena listened carefully to his apology and his questions, her responses revealing the thoughtfulness that had characterized her handling of the entire situation. "The problem wasn't that you didn't know my background," she explained, her tone educational rather than accusatory. "The problem was that you assumed my worth as a human being was determined by my job title and your perception of my education level. Every person you encounter has a story, struggles, dreams, and dignity that deserve respect regardless of how they earn their living or what circumstances have shaped their current situation." Her words carried the authority of someone who had spent years teaching and who understood how to transform moments of conflict into opportunities for genuine learning and growth. By the end of their conversation, something fundamental had shifted in Omar's understanding of both himself and his relationship to the world around him. He spoke about his family's educational foundation in Dubai, his growing awareness of his own prejudices, and his desire to channel his resources toward meaningful change rather than mere charitable gestures. Elena found herself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of partnership rather than patronization. Recognizing in Omar's transformed demeanor the potential for genuine collaboration on projects that could honor the dignity of working people while creating real opportunities for positive change. The conversation ended with tentative plans for future discussions, both participants understanding that trust would need to be rebuilt slowly and demonstrated through actions rather than words. Elena's modest apartment in the Bronzeville neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the upscale world of Marina Bay Steakhouse, its small rooms filled with the warmth of a family that had learned to find richness in love rather than material possessions. The living room served multiple purposes: physical therapy space during the day, family gathering area in the evening, and quiet refuge where Elena could decompress after her demanding work schedule. Photographs covered nearly every surface, documenting a family's journey from rural Mississippi to Chicago during the Great Migration. From hope to struggle to resilience, each image telling part of a story that had shaped Elena's understanding of what truly mattered in life. The apartment's walls couldn't contain the dreams that had once filled Elena's academic life, but they held something perhaps more valuable, the unshakable foundation of family love and mutual support. Carlos Johnson sat in his wheelchair near the window, his hands working through physical therapy exercises with the determination that had carried him through 3 years of recovery. The brain injury had stolen some of his mobility and slowed his speech, but it hadn't diminished the sharp intelligence in his eyes or the fierce pride he felt for his daughter's accomplishments. When Elena showed him the video of her linguistic demonstration, his reaction was immediate and powerful tears of joy mixed with the satisfaction of a father who had always known his daughter possessed extraordinary gifts. "Baby girl," he said slowly, his words careful but clear. "Your daddy always knew you were meant for something special. Tonight, the whole world got to see what I've always seen." His voice carried the weight of years spent worrying that Elena had sacrificed too much for his care, and the relief of finally witnessing her talents receive the recognition they deserved. Maria Johnson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face showing the exhaustion that came from years of caregiving, balanced with the joy of seeing her family's story, shared with dignity and respect. She had watched the video 3 times, each viewing revealing new details that filled her heart with pride for the daughter who had given up so much to keep their family together. "You could have been angry," she said, settling into the worn armchair that had become her evening refuge. "You could have been bitter about the choices you had to make. Instead, you showed them what real class looks like, what real education means." Her words carried the wisdom of a woman whose grandparents had migrated from Alabama to Chicago, seeking better opportunities, who understood that true worth had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with character and dignity. The $1,000 from Omar's bet lay on the kitchen table, crisp bills that represented 2 weeks of Elena's combined income from all 3 jobs. The money would cover her father's physical therapy sessions for the next 2 months, providing treatments that insurance deemed non-essential, but that made the difference between progress and stagnation in his recovery. Elena looked at the bills with mixed emotions, gratitude for the financial relief they provided, but also recognition that they had been earned through a confrontation she wouldn't have chosen. "I keep thinking about that night," she said, settling onto the couch beside her father's wheelchair. "Not about being humiliated or proving myself, but about how many people must go through their days being judged and dismissed by others who know nothing about their lives or their struggles." The conversation turned to Elena's years at the university, memories that had been carefully stored away during the intensity of her current responsibilities, but that the evening's events had brought flooding back. She spoke about her research with immigrant communities, the languages she had helped preserve, the students she had taught, who had gone on to build bridges between cultures through their own linguistic abilities. Her parents listened with the careful attention of people who understood that their daughter's current sacrifice had made possible not just their family's survival, but also her profound understanding of what education truly meant, not the accumulation of degrees or prestigious positions, but the development of wisdom, empathy, and the ability to connect with people across all boundaries. Carlos reached over to take his daughter's hand, his grip weaker than it had been before his accident, but steady with conviction. "You think you gave up your dreams for us," he said, his words coming slowly but with absolute certainty. "But maybe you just found a different way to live them. You're still teaching, still building bridges between people, still using your gifts to make the world better, just not in the way you planned." His observation struck Elena with unexpected force, helping her recognize that her current life wasn't a deviation from her calling, but perhaps a deeper expression of it, serving people directly, understanding their struggles firsthand, and maintaining her dignity in circumstances that tested every value she held dear. The discussion about Omar's proposal had been ongoing for several days, Elena weighing the potential benefits against her natural skepticism about accepting help from someone who had originally sought to humiliate her. Her parents offered perspectives shaped by their own experiences with prejudice and their understanding of how rare it was for people to genuinely change their worldview based on a single encounter. "Judge him by what he does, not what he says," Maria advised, her words carrying the practical wisdom of someone who had learned to evaluate people based on actions rather than promises. If he's serious about making amends, he'll prove it through consistency and respect, not just through money or grand gestures. Elena had spent hours reviewing the materials Omar had provided about his family's educational foundation, impressed despite herself by the scope and thoughtfulness of their work in promoting cross-cultural understanding and supporting educational opportunities for underserved communities. The Foundation's mission aligned remarkably well with her own values and expertise, suggesting that a partnership might benefit both parties while serving a larger purpose. But she remained cautious, understanding that power dynamics could easily corrupt even well-intentioned collaborations, and that she would need to maintain control over any projects that bore her name or represented her values and vision. The evening's conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Dr. Sarah Chen, Elena's former colleague at the University of Chicago, who had seen the viral video and wanted to reconnect with her brilliant former peer. The conversation that followed was emotional and encouraging, filled with updates about academic developments Elena had missed and expressions of admiration for the choices she had made to prioritize family over career advancement. Dr. Chen extended an invitation for Elena to consider returning to academic work, either full-time or as a consultant on projects that could accommodate her family responsibilities, opening possibilities that Elena had assumed were permanently closed. As the evening wound down, Elena found herself looking through a box of mementos from her university days photographs with students from around the world, letters of thanks from communities whose languages she had helped preserve, awards recognizing her contributions to linguistic research and cross-cultural understanding. The items weren't relics of a lost life, but reminders of skills and passions that had never disappeared, only been redirected toward different but equally meaningful purposes. Her parents watched her rediscover these memories with expressions that mixed joy for her past accomplishments with pride for her current strength, understanding that their daughter's story was still being written and that the most important chapters might yet lie ahead. The decision about Omar's partnership proposal crystallized as Elena reflected on the evening's conversations and the broader implications of the viral attention her story had received. She would accept his offer, but on terms that preserved her autonomy and honored the dignity of all working people who might benefit from their collaboration. The partnership would focus on creating educational opportunities that respected the wisdom and experience of diverse communities, while providing practical skills for economic advancement, ensuring that no one would ever again be dismissed based solely on their current circumstances. Most importantly, it would be guided by the principle that had shaped Elena's entire approach to the evening's challenges, that every person deserves respect regardless of their current circumstances, and that true education builds bridges rather than walls between different communities and experiences. 8 months after the evening that changed everything, Elena Johnson stood before a modest storefront in the heart of Pilsen, watching workers install the final letters of the sign that would announce the Elena's Language Bridge Center to the community. The morning sun cast long shadows across 18th Street, illuminating a neighborhood that had become synonymous with Mexican-American culture and resilience. The building itself was unremarkable, a former community center that had sat empty for 2 years. But Elena saw it as something far more significant. This space would become a bridge between cultures, a place where the dignity of every person would be honored, regardless of their background or current circumstances. Omar al-Rashid arrived precisely on time for the press conference, his presence drawing attention from local reporters and community members who had gathered to witness the center's official launch. His transformation over the past months had been genuine and sustained, marked by consistent actions rather than grand gestures. He had spent weeks in Pilsen, listening to community members, learning about their needs and aspirations, and gradually earning the trust of people who had every reason to be skeptical of wealthy outsiders bearing promises. His role in the day's ceremony was deliberately modest. He would introduce Elena as the visionary behind the project, then step back to let her expertise and passion take center stage. "This center represents something extraordinary," Omar began, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized their first encounter. It was conceived by someone who understands both the power of education and the dignity of honest work. Someone who has lived the challenges that many of our students will face. He gestured toward Elena with obvious respect, his words carefully chosen to honor her vision while acknowledging his own role as supporter rather than savior. The crowd of about 50 people included local business owners, community leaders, and families whose children would soon benefit from the center's programs. Elena watched their faces, seeing a mixture of hope and healthy skepticism that reflected the immigrant experience of promises made and broken by well-meaning outsiders. Elena stepped forward to address the gathering, her confidence earned through months of careful planning and community engagement. She had insisted that the center's programs be designed in collaboration with local families rather than imposed from outside, ensuring that the curriculum would address real needs rather than theoretical ideals. "Language is more than communication," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "It's the key to opportunity, the bridge between cultures, and the foundation of human dignity. This center will honor every language that walks through our doors, recognizing that bilingual and multilingual abilities are gifts to be celebrated, not barriers to be overcome." The programs Elena had designed reflected her deep understanding of both linguistic education and the practical realities of immigrant life. Morning classes would offer English instruction for adults who worked evening shifts, while afternoon sessions would provide heritage language preservation for children whose families wanted to maintain connections to their cultural roots. Evening workshops would focus on professional development, helping bilingual speakers leverage their linguistic abilities in business settings. Most importantly, the center would operate on a sliding scale fee structure, ensuring that cost would never prevent someone from accessing education that could transform their economic prospects. Carlos Johnson attended the opening ceremony in his wheelchair, his presence a testament to both his recovery and his fierce pride in his daughter's accomplishments. The past 8 months had brought significant improvements in his mobility and speech, progress that Elena attributed as much to his renewed sense of purpose as to his physical therapy regimen. He had become one of the center's most enthusiastic supporters, offering to help with maintenance and sharing his own story of immigration and resilience with students who needed to hear that success could take many different forms. His presence at the ceremony carried special significance, representing the family values that had inspired Elena's vision and the personal sacrifices that had shaped her understanding of what education truly meant. The first class session that afternoon drew 25 students ranging in age from 16 to 67, representing 8 different countries and countless individual stories of hope and determination. Elena moved through the room with the natural teaching ability that had made her successful at the university level, but her approach had been enriched by 3 years of serving people directly and understanding their struggles firsthand. She began each student's introduction by asking them to share something about their heritage, language, and culture, immediately establishing that their backgrounds were assets rather than obstacles to be overcome. Maria Santos, a young mother from Guatemala, spoke hesitantly about her dreams of becoming a nurse, but her fear that her accent would prevent her from being taken seriously in medical school. Roberto Fernandez, a former engineer from Venezuela, explained his frustration at working construction jobs despite his technical expertise, limited only by language barriers that prevented him from demonstrating his knowledge. Each story reinforced Elena's conviction that the center would serve not just as a language school, but as a space where people could reclaim their professional identities and pursue dreams that circumstances had forced them to defer. Omar observed from a corner chair, his role minimal, but attention complete. He had asked Elena for permission to volunteer, understanding his presence needed to be earned. His contributions would focus on business mentorship, using his connections to create pathways for students pursuing entrepreneurial ventures. The partnership had evolved into collaboration based on mutual respect and shared commitment to empowering communities. As the afternoon class concluded, Elena felt completion that had everything to do with new beginnings. The journey from that humiliating evening to this moment had taught her that dignity was an internal compass, guiding how she responded to challenges and opportunities. The center represented not just a return to teaching, but an evolution shaped by experiences that deepened her understanding of education's true purpose. The evening news coverage of the center's opening focused on Elena's remarkable journey from viral sensation to community leader. But the story that mattered most was still being written in the lives of students who would discover new possibilities through education delivered with respect and cultural sensitivity. Elena Johnson had found her way back to teaching, but on terms that honored both her expertise and her hard-earned wisdom about the dignity that exists in every honest pursuit of a better life. The bridge she had built connected not just languages, but communities, creating pathways to opportunity that would serve families for generations to come. Every person we encounter carries invisible stories, dreams deferred, talents hidden beneath circumstances, dignity that transcends any uniform or job title. Elena Johnson's journey reminds us that respect isn't earned through wealth or status, but through our shared humanity. The server at your table, the clerk at the store, the worker you pass on the street, each possesses depths unknown and gifts unrecognized. True education isn't about accumulating degrees, but building bridges between hearts and cultures. When we choose humility over arrogance, curiosity over judgment, we discover that the most profound lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers. Everyone deserves dignity,